Hello, everybody. Hello, North America. Speaking from the UK here. So I'm Dr. Hilary Orange. I work at Swansea University at the moment on a steel heritage project. And so my background is in archaeology. I've worked in the field, and then more recently, through my PhD, I've become more interested in industrial heritage. But I also have a separate hat, which is contemporary archaeology, and I'm currently chair of the CHAT group. And CHAT, if you haven't heard of it, is the Contemporary and Historical Archaeology in Theory group. It's a fantastic group, so do look us up. We actually have an archaeology festival coming online very soon. And my talk today is going to be about humour in the industrial workplace. And I'm going to be focusing on the intangibility of humour and looking at a Cornish tin mine. Cornwall is a region in the southwest of the UK. So this is the title of my talk, Humour in the Industrial Workplace, Laughter in the Dry, which is a particular building I'm going to be talking about. And my case study comes from Cornwall in the southwest of the UK. And I guess I grew up hearing about industrial workplace humour, because my father and grandfather both worked in the engineering, in light engineering in factories. And they would talk about banter and nicknames, and also the jokes played on apprentices. So most famously, certainly here in the UK, being sent to the storeroom to get tartan paint, or my particular favourite, which is a new bubble for the spirit level. And then I kind of forgot about all that until I was doing fieldwork and research in Cornwall, where I was looking at the remains of the tin and copper mining industries. And I became drawn back periodically to this particular tin mine, Geevor. And it was through really to the former miners who are now mine guides at Geevor that I became really interested in this whole topic of humour, which tends to be really peripheral in terms of the archaeological discourse, although there has been some work and some writing done on it. In 1992, there was a collected volume edited by Bill Siller called Digging for a Laugh. There's been various other papers subsequently. And so Jeff's volume was about intangibility, and I thought this is an apt moment to actually return to this topic and look at my data again in detail. So moving on to my next slide. So that's a picture of Geva Tin Mine location map. So it's a coastal site. Beyond the horizon is the Atlantic Ocean, far southwest. And Geva Tin Mine was a 20th century mine. It opened in 1911 and was an important employer in West Cornwall for much of the 20th century. And then, like most of the Cornish tin mines, its fortune subsided in the 1980s, and the majority of the workforce were laid off in 86. Mining resumed for a few years, and then the pumps were switched off in 1990. And then, due to the work of a local charity and also former miners and managers, it reopened in 93 as a visitor attraction. So some of you, if you've been to the UK, been to Cornwall, you may actually have visited, I don't know. And so if you do go, you can walk around extensive above ground remains in and out of these buildings, many of which have been kind of reconstructed with these time capsule interiors. And the building I want to concentrate on is this one, the Dry. The Dry was called this because it was where the miners would dry off their clothes after being underground. It was where the hot pipes circulated through the building. And so the space is interesting hierarchically because you have a manager's offices at one end, and then you have a shift bosses area where they control production and control who was underground and what was going on. And then at the other end of the building, you had the actual workforce locker rooms and also the showers. And so it's actually a really interesting space to explore in terms of looking at the relationship between different workers and types of workers on site. Now, according to newspaper reports from 1993, no, sorry, not 1993, 2001, the doors to the dry were locked until the summer of 2001, when the building was reopened as part of an expansion of visitor attractions on site. And so this idea is that you go into this kind of Mary Celeste and that everything in here is kind of untouched. That's not actually the case, but that's how it's presented, and that's certainly how it feels. So in the shift bosses area, there is, for example, a telephone directory dating to 1985. I can give so many examples of this. In the manager's office, there's a Guardian newspaper also dating from 1985. Now in the locker room, there's all this kind of paraphernalia of everyday life, including helmets and Wellington boots. And these kinds of what I see as being material nostalgia, that particularly if you're a certain age and you remember 1980s like I do, you will recognize certain types of soap and maybe even certain stickers on the locker room doors. And so although this is presented as a time capsule, in fact it's not. I've seen the photographs from the period between 1990 and 93, and it shows a very different scene of kind of things piled up in corners and pretty much empty spaces. So what happened was there was a kind of crowdsourcing with the community, and objects were actually relocated and brought back into this space, and the space has been essentially just. And the other thing is, there's the kind of a heritage intervention paraphernalia, particularly in terms of signage. So you get signs like this, please do not use a towel, or please do not use the showers or the toilets. And there's also various kinds of heritage interpretation. So interestingly, every miner that's ever worked at Geevor, even if they've only worked there for 2 weeks, when they return, they have their photograph taken, and their photograph, their portrait, becomes part of this kind of gallery procession leading down through the exit corridor. And then, and then there's also photographs of underground scenes and kind of a day in the life of text panels talking about the day of the life of the timberman or the stoper. So this is clearly not 1985 or 1990. This is 2016, because it's now a heritage space. And so I became very intrigued by the dry, particularly because it has this very uncanny atmosphere. And so to understand what the dry was like in the period of the live mine, I began to talk to and get to know some of the former miners who now work there as volunteers and guides. And I asked them questions like, well, what was it like on an average day? And what are your memories of the dry? And how has it changed? And also, how do they feel to be working back there again? And to be showing visitors around a space that they know intimately. And so I've got various interview extracts I could show, but I don't have the time. But I'm just going to show you one, and I'm just going to briefly talk it over. So David Harvey was a former stoper at Geevor, and what he said was that when you go into the dry, it's very quiet. And you can almost imagine the bantering that went on. And he mentioned the fact that it's a very atmospheric place. And he said, and a number of the miner guides said the same thing, that it had this sepulchral quality of being almost like being in a church or a chapel or a cathedral, a feeling of reverence, if you like. And then he went on to say, but you don't get the sound, and you don't get the stink of the filthy clothes. And he laughed. He said, I mean, the clothes you worked in, you were hot. My stope was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and you would sweat like hell, and it would rot the clothes. And he then goes on to talk a little bit more about the smell and stink. I said, that's really interesting, because there's no smell in the dry now. And he said, no, there isn't. It's because, the carbolic smell had a particular pungent quality, if you like. And then he mentioned his background. He grew up on a farm, and he led this quite sheltered life. And when he first went to Geevor as a young man into the dry, and he saw this scene of 60, 70 naked men in the shower room, he realized that it was, if you like, a kind of it was a new experience for him as a young man, but it was also a very noisy place. And as soon as you went in the morning, there were people there bantering with each other, and nicknames and all of that. And he mentioned he had so many stories to tell, he could hardly ever get out of a dry when he had visitors to show around. So these interviews brought to life patterns of shifts and miners' language, and also relationships between miners and management. And as I interviewed former miners, I began to realise that humour kept cropping up. It appeared to be a central mechanism through which this bond between miners was sustained. And John Clark has talked about this in a volume on archaeology and humour. And he's pointed out that laughter creates and reinforces social identities. So what I did as an archaeologist is I then went round the dry on my own, looking for traces of humour, looking for material traces of humour. And there really isn't very much. So in the managers, there's a fake plastic Cornish pasty on the desk of a former mine captain. And I wonder whether this was a moment of whimsy, given the pasty's iconic status in Cornwall. And had somebody, a member of staff or a volunteer at the museum, put this there as a kind of a note of whimsy or a joke. Otherwise, humour is mainly conveyed through graffiti in the dry. Here in the shift bosses area, there's a line that reads, JT Freestone, 1 day's holiday with or without Mrs. Bucket. And then there's also graffiti that goes over a door frame in the locker room, which reads, Happy birthday, Harvey. The doom and gloom is not over yet. Now, I'm not exactly sure, but I think maybe some of this graffiti might be more recent, could actually date to the heritage part of the site, or it could be redrawn periodically because it looks quite new. And why I think it's important and interesting to look at humour in the industrial workplace is, well, I'm going to quote Ben Croxford now, who's also written on humour in archaeology. And he said that humour is a very real and complex element of human behaviour, and it's worthy of our consideration as archaeologists. And I think that humour matters in studies of industrial archaeology or heritage or archaeology more generally, because often I feel that archaeology presents people in the past as being serious people doing serious things. And often we don't actually look at these kind of aspects of behaviour within societies closely enough. And also when it comes to industrial societies in the past, I was very influenced by what Judith Ulfrey and Tim Putman said in 1992 in their volume, where they asserted that popular perceptions of the history of industrial civilization have tended to mythologize the heroic, the demonic, and the romantic aspects of industrial culture. And I began to realize that this comedic vein, if you like, was largely missing from the archaeological or historical discourse. The heroic, the demonic, and the romantic circulate through narrative of Cornish mining culture. So there are many examples I can give, but I'm only going to give a couple of examples from public art. The statue on the left is from the industrial town of Red Roof in Cornwall. This is the tin miner that was created by the Scottish artist David Annand, and it's striking this heroic pose, you know, figure leaning forward, outstretched arms, in one hand a pick and in the other a tin ingot. And then the image on the right is actually at the entrance to Geevor Mine, and it's another very virile, kind of masculine, powerful, heroic figure. So if you look at the Cornish miner, these are the kinds of images that repeat, these kind of heroic, virile, masculine figures. And then you have Poldark from your BBC TV series, which is your epitome of romance and the hero. So, but there's a problem. It's not just about the intangibility of humour in relation to the archaeological records. It's also about the way that John Clark has said that laughter can play this dual social role. It creates and reinforces social identities, but it also operates as a response to social inversion, situations where normality is upended. So humour can be used to resist authority, to subvert social norms, and to delineate in groups and out groups. And so it provides potentially profitable avenues through which to look at themes such as power, resistance, and protest in the industrial past. But it can also cause offence. So there's a girly calendar in the manager's office in the drive that's been roped off. And Peter Oakley has talked about the role of gold mining sites in the mythology of the United States. And he's said that these pose some problems for site interpretation because the sexual lives of these frontier towns can be difficult to present to the visiting public in case of causing offence. So when you have things like bawdy humour, if you like, and bawdy is going to be different to different people, how do industrial museums actually deal with that? So that's one aspect of humour that can be problematic. But I still think that workplace humour can be claimed as a form of industrial heritage. And on sound, again, coming back to sound, interestingly, Penny O'Connor has set out a really good case of thinking about the sounds associated with place. And she talks about sound in terms of cultural heritage significance, but it may be distinctive or even unique in particular places. That's certainly the sense I get from talking to the miner guides at Geevor. And that relates to Schaefer's term, if you like, of a sound mark, which is analogous to the idea of a landmark that has a meaning to a social group. But there are even further challenges because humour is so time and specific. I don't understand who J.D. Freestone was or who his relationship was to Mrs. Bucket or whether he went on holiday with her or not. And maybe insistent questioning might serve to, in a sense, spoil the joke. You know, you have to be there at the time to really get the joke. So to finish, what I was going to say, and what I'm going to say again, is that intangible industrial culture are, I think, really interesting and important to consider, but they are difficult to record and to interpret to visitors because they are so fleeting. So I think that the best approach is this mixed bag approach that incorporates the archaeological record material with the oral history, also with historic documents such as diaries and other kinds of records. And despite the challenges, I think because of this emphasis on, certainly in terms of Cornwall, on the heroic, the demonic and the romantic, I believe there's really great value looking at humour in terms of an important practice and behaviour that was significant to workers in the past. And there's value, I say, in mining the comedic vein, excuse the pun. So thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my slightly interrupted talk to you tonight, or this afternoon. Thank you.